Sorry. And yes, I'm extremely happy to be here today. And since I'm both a presenter as well as the chair of this panel, I would like to say a few words about how it has been developed or invented. So in 2018, I met Deljana Iossifova in Shanghai, and we had many strange things in common. So for instance, we were both interested in toilets. She had done a project on sanitation in China, and I was fascinated about this Chinese place about toilets. For instance, the place Sesuo Toilet by Guoshixing. And so she invited me to participate in her conference at the Center of Urban Studies at the University of Manchester in 2019, a conference called Healthy Cities, a conference on infrastructure in Asia. So I went there and I listened to so many presentations about roads and bridges and sanitation. And I did not really know at the beginning about how to connect this with my own research area, which is Chinese theater, right? Plays, productions, and so on. So, however, at a certain moment, I get to realize that actually the main problem that all of these architects and engineers and anthropologists, the main problem they were talking about was the problem about the interconnection of the infrastructure and the people and the everyday life, the health, the cultural practice. How does the infrastructure shape this cultural practice? And how does the cultural practice ask or demand a new infrastructure? So this was interesting for me. As you all know, there is so many new playhouses in China, right? You probably have seen these futuristic buildings, and if you have not seen them, you will see them today in this panel. And so how are they interconnected with the theater? So in addition, if you look at the history of Chinese theater places, you can discover that they have been changing so much throughout the whole 20th century. And however, as a researcher on Chinese theater, I have never been thinking about these buildings and even less about the interconnection between this infrastructure and the theater as a practice, the place, the performance, and so on. So this is exactly what we want to do in this project that we are actually presenting here today for the first time in front of an audience. So therefore, we are also very thankful for any kind of recommendations. So we want to understand how these infrastructural changes and transitions of theater places in the 20th and 21st century China are interconnected with changes in theater practice and other practices. And we want to experiment with some methods. So how can we think about this? How can we study this problem? So in order to discuss this, we have a bunch of different people here today: a theater practitioner, an architect, scholars in Chinese studies. However, I think that our identities are already very blurred, of course. So let me very briefly introduce the people in this panel. Our first speaker is Raimund Rosarius. He is a scholar in theater studies as well as a theater practitioner. He holds a master's degree in directing from the Central Academy of Drama in Beijing, and he is currently both writing his PhD thesis at the LMU Munich as well as also teaching at the University of Salzburg. The second speaker is Deljana Iossifova. She is a senior lecturer in urban studies at the University of Manchester, and she has widely published on topics related to infrastructure in China and to sanitation, of course. And she was actually trained as an architect at the ETH Zurich. And she used to design golf courses for the Poly Group in China. And the Poly Group is, of course, also very familiar to theater people because they also run many of these large theaters in China, right? These Baoli theaters. And our discussant is Josh Sternberg. Josh is a senior lecturer at the University of, in Chinese Studies at the University of Sydney. He is an expert in all kinds of Chinese theater, from traditional opera to modern theater, and he has published on all these topics. He holds a PhD from the university in Nanjing, and he has also translated Chinese literature. And I myself am a kind of assistant professor at the University of Munich. I have started researching Chinese theater at the Beijing Normal University, and where I studied for my master's and my PhD. And my recent publication is a book on contemporary Chinese comedies. So now I would like to ask Raimund to start with his presentation.
Never have to.
Yes, now we can hear you, sorry, yeah. Could you start again, please?
Thank you, Anna, thank you. All Wujin's stage, grand theaters, their surrounding festivals, and the corporeal impact of theatrical architecture on receptive societies in the People's Republic of China. This lecture is an autoethnographic exploration into how the colossal theater buildings in the contemporary People's Republic of China affect Thespian artists' labor and through their artistic endeavor reach stationary and migrant city societies as an audience. It investigates how reciprocal tensions between the lavish theater architecture and the often precarious nature of theater artists' life and work come into being and manifest themselves within theater festivals that surround but rarely incorporate a grand theater. The object of my study, which you see here, is the Wujin Grand Theater in the southern Chinese province of Zhejiang and its surrounding festival, the 2016 Wujin Theater International Theater Festival. In this context, my multinational theater group, Huxiju, that had been established in Beijing in 2014, presented my play The Old Go Bad, Laura and Bian Huai, as a theater play outdoors. As I wrote the play, directed it and played in it, my descriptions offer a direct insight into a theater troupe's and individual artists' impression on the impact of a grand theater and the events that accompany it, which have on the creators of theater arts in China. Before I autoethnographically examine my experience during the 2016 Wujin International Theater Festival, I first suggest a deep dive into theater studies as a discipline, mainly to show what we in this transdisciplinary working group, through mutual crisscross pollination, do different to conventional discourse in theater studies. In theater studies discourse, theatrical architecture is usually examined independent of the performances that take place within it. That is, if it is examined at all. How theatrical architecture influences the live arts is widely ignored and usually only made a matter of discourse as soon as non-theatrical architecture is involved. When a play is staged in a hospital, a prison, or an abandoned factory, only then the surrounding architecture becomes a topic. When the stage is a professional stage, however, it becomes a blank slate in the eyes of many observers, which it is not. In light of a festival that ponderously claims all Wujin's a stage in its advertisement material, professional and non-professional stages and their implications should be put under the focus of a renewed investigation. Numerous theater scholars have defined the ephemeral staging instead of the material stage as the omphalos of theatrical arts and its analysis. Building upon the knowledge transfer that is circulating in this working group, this presentation aims to challenge this commonplace understanding in the study of theater and theaters. How does theatrical architecture perform? How does it play its role? The ancient Greek thea, both theater and theory derives from, indeed signifies both action and observation. Active observation is thus an essential part of theatron, the theater building. Observation can obviously not be suppressed while approaching or entering the architecture. Entering a theater building or an outdoor theater scenery, the surrounding architecture is defined, definitely not the blank slate theater studies implicitly makes us believe. On top of that, observation, more so in the ancient sense, is not limited to visual or auditory senses, but it is a process based upon multisensory experience. The impact of theater architecture not only on the conventional live audience, but a whole city society, encompassing nearly its entire social fabric in virtually all facets of life, becomes exceptionally evident in the case of mainland China, not only in its metropolises, but also on its margins, which Wujin definitely is an example of. In my presentation, I will try to support this bold claim and perform this embodied shift through a multimodal case study of the Wujin Grand Theater. I will venture to make graspable how the construction of a colossal theater architecture in a Chinese small town, like a spacecraft of alien origin, changed its social fabric permanently, whilst not to aesthetic new permanence. Wuhan has been designed as a constantly changing social habitat that is fortified by maturing Thespian troops. To stress the self-reflexive standpoint, I would first like to explain the presuppositions I had towards Wuhan. First of all, it gave me the feeling of pride when my theater troupe Hushiju was admitted to the Wuhan International Theater Festival, which along with the Nanluo Guxiang Theater Festival, which we participated in 3 times, is the most well-known national theater festival in the circles of the performing arts scene we were part of in Beijing. However, my enthusiasm was made cloudy when our first female cast refused her participation in the project, which she had never done before. Her rejection of a theater festival well known across mainland China and beyond took me by surprise. What was it that made her, one of the most sincere and ambitious theater artists I have ever met, reject in an instant and forcefully what seemed to me a rare career chance? It was definitely not the prospects of another job or another project lurking around, as I knew she was without engagement at that time. She did not specify what her criticism towards the festival was, independent of the performance we were going to show, which I had not even sent her at that point. The only thing she had mentioned, and I had understood in my Mandarin that was still poor, rather limited in 2016, my second year in China, was that it was unprofessional, bourgeoisie, and outdoors. Bourgeoisie is a term often used in Beijing theater circles to describe stagings of the off-theater scene, the independent theater producers. As such, it is mainly used by protagonists of the state theater and its training institutions to derogatively describe productions that are made by more experimental artists, usually bare of all funding in China. Normally, she would have repudiated the term, as many of the theater works she participated in would have been described as bourgeoisie by artists only involved in state theater productions. They would use the term as a derogative variation of experimental or independent, while the artist in those works was used the latter or the term juchang or xiao juchang to describe the genre and the institutional setting their art precariously thrived in. In this rare instance, she chose this term, and it appeared to be intentionally and precisely this troubled term. She chose bourgeoisie not to derogate an art form or as the state theater artists did, but essentially as a description of how invited artists were treated, as I will show in the course of this lecture. We had been admitted to the Wuhan International Theater Festival Street Carnival without knowing what that meant, with the exception of our first female cast. My play, The Old Gazette, which we were going to present at the festival, was named after a popular social media discourse in Chinese web about public square dancing, Guangchangwu. The latter is a popular dance study genre in which dozens of mostly elderly people dance to recorded music. The musicality usually also involves clapping, stepping, singing, and shouting. With their dance, the elderly fill whole public squares, which are of Chinese architectural dimensions with sounds and movement. The genre has become so popular that it intervenes with the life of city societies, be it in the great metropolises or in small towns. It also has developed into an intergenerational conflict. When the elderly play their music so loud that the younger generations that have to go to school, to university, to work the next day are kept from sleeping. This conflict has culminated in an incident that sparked a public outrage in Chinese social media. In a small town in the province of Henan, a group of Guangchangwu dancers had been gathering around a hospital, repeatedly performing deep into the night so that the patients in intensive care could not sleep. It was a dance macabre, especially as people retiring are said to have only one objective left, their own longevity. Apart from the artistic and entertainment aspect of the Guangchangwu, thoughts of health and well-being are important thoughts within the Guangchangwu universe. Its performers do not only pursue their hobby for the fun of it, but as a means to improve their health and prolong their lives. This is part of the reason why Guangzhou Wu consists mainly of low-impact movements and tender sequences of movement rather than pronouncing sportiveness or virtuosity. The movements of the Guangzhou Wu do nothing but improve their health and prolong their lives whilst not overexerting the body. It is not hard to imagine that people performing in the Guangzhou Wu usually live longer, but in the case of Guangzhou Wu in front of the hospital, the elderly's well-being was tinged with the deterioration of other people's lives. In case of the intensive care station, it could very well be that they sacrificed patients' lives for their own well-being. In response to the small-town event that had gone viral in Chinese social media, netizens were posing the question whether the old have gone bad. Most netizens were shocked by what seemed to be an impertinence, even cruelty of the elderly who were performing Guangzhou Wu even after they were asked by the hospital to change places. They seemed to care only about their own advantage and had the crust to self-absorbedly seek their own objectives of entertainment and longevity while other people lay dying in the hospital. One remark in the netizen community then made a splash. It argued that it was not the old that had gone bad, it was the bad that had grown old. Performers of the Guangzhou Wu, posts within the netizen community began arguing, were precisely that generation that the Red Guard had performed gruesome deeds in time, that as Red Guards had performed gruesome deeds in times of the Cultural Revolution. At that time, so the argument, they learned to only care about their own survival. They had been trained by history to be selfish. A new discourse solidified that stated that the bad had grown old, manifesting a deeply political intergenerational conflict that was stained with audacity by the elderly and a gerontophobic tendency by the youth. Guangzhou Wu set out to be the grotesque memento mori that unfolded questions of life, death in a hateful intergenerational conflict from both sides. In our play, instead of choosing sides, we wanted to pose multiple questions towards the popular discourse that focused on the instance of Guangzhou Wu in front of intensive care stations. Amongst the new angles we found towards the discourse was the circumstance that the small town apparently lacks public spaces for the thousands of Guangzhou Wu performers willing to pursue their hobby every evening. Instead of posing the intergenerational question of fairness, we addressed the meta-structure that led to the conflict. Essentially, it was a live arts piece about questions urban development should be concerned with. From the directorial perspective, we worked a lot with alienation techniques. The first part of the performance was an adaptation of the Guangzhou Wu, where we, that is an actor from Russia, an actor from Chile, me as an actor from Germany, and two Chinese actors performed typical Guangzhou Wu movements, only even more simplified than the original Guangzhou Wu. The performance should shout amateurish simplicity. In the performance, there was no music, instead a shouting of Lao Nian Bian Huai, the old go bad, in strict but simplistic rhythm and sentences that we put into the mouths of the elderly, mostly bold descriptions of how self-confident and self-righteous the old presumably were. Then there were two scenes, one with an elderly mother that tried to convince her son not to move to a bigger city, pursue his dreams, but stay with her and devote his life to caring for her. All in cliché-laden dialogue that, however, was realistic that it hurt, as some of the audience members remarked. Another scene, by instance, of Guangzhou Wu that restructured the performance as a whole was a scene with an elderly cheater making recourse to another phenomenon the elderly were accused of. They are said to let themselves fall down and accuse younger people of having hit them, mostly in front of cars, but also with pedestrians. Their aim is to extort injury awards. In this scene, an elderly man shouts for help and a young lad is caught in the moral dilemma whether to help him or cautious of a cheater. Whether to help him or be cautious of a cheater. We played both elderly characters with puppets designed by our Syrian puppet maker Ahmad Roumani. that resembled very old age, while they did not bear Chinese facial characteristics, but rather seemed allied from a fairy tale to further stress the alienation effect. In preparation of our performance for the festival in Beijing, where we rehearsed, we were eager to bring online public discourse back to where it belonged, to the small town context in which it had appeared first. Wujian for us was such a small town. Interestingly, we had to find that such a conflict could not happen in Wujian. The inhabitants of Wujian had been moved out of Wujian's center to multi-story buildings at the outskirts. During the day, some of them were employed to keep on living in the center so that Wujian appeared less merely a stage. Apart from theater performances, Wujian center was dominated by souvenir shops, fancy restaurants, serving local kitchen with moderate prices. It was said that the restaurants, under the supervision of the local government and the festival organizers, were to keep their prices moderate and their servings local. Instead, thus, we brought real-life discourse into the Thespian leisure park world that was Wujian. All Wujian's a stage. The slogan of the festival could be translated into Wujian's nothing but a stage. One could enter the central part of Wujian through a counter at which tickets had to be paid. As a Thespian troupe performing at the festival, we were lucky enough not to have to pay for tickets. Free tickets, a very modest fee for food, and free overnight stays in a bedraggled hostel at the outskirts of Wujian, where no theater whatsoever was about to happen, were the replacement of any salary. Bourgeoisie, as malicious tongues would have it. All Wujian's stage meant that there had to be hundreds of performers, which for the festival organizers apparently meant that they, before anything, had to be cheap. From the ticket counter, one could enter a scenery that was dominated by water and indeed opened up a gorgeous sight once one had passed the other side of the ticket counter. From there, one could either go by boat to the part of the city where the performance took place, or take a long walk across the fruit bridges. No matter what form of transportation one chose, one would always pass the Wujian Grand Theater that evidently was a popular site to take photos in front of it. However, during the day at which the performance outside took place, there were no shows at the Grand Theater. The gigantic lotus-shaped Grand Theater became as much a scenery as urban planners would probably have hoped for. We performed our play at the place where the Wujian Grand Theater could still be seen in the background. Unfortunately, this place became the jetty for the boats. During one of our performances, a huge group of tourists arrived in the middle of our stage. All Wujian's a stage, remember? We were asked by some particularly curious and pushy tourists where we were from and what we were doing here in the middle of our performance. This was one of the realities one had to adapt to when performing in Wujian. Not being autocritical about the festival, one could still see the exploitative tendencies and see that single performances did not matter as much as the huge numbers of stages that was advertised. The Grand Theater with its huge cupola that was glooming in different tones of yellow during the day was less a satellite than a sun never to be reached. What was staged in the Grand Theaters were invited Western performances like one by the German director Anton Romero Nunes. The tickets were so expensive that we remained unaffordable for the main body of thespians performing in Wujian. What I wanted to show in this lecture was how far apart the ambitious architectural foundation of Wujian were when contrasting it with the realities of thespians performing within the architecture. Layers of meaning which tell about precarious arts are inscribed into a theater building that is a case of urban development schemes rather than a temple for the arts. However, a distinct and beautiful memories are interwoven with every look I take at the photos of the Wujian Grand Theater. As a thespian troupe, we have made peace with Wujian's ambitiousness in urban planning that ignored both the locals and the. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Raimund, for telling us so much about the Wujian, the Grand Theater, but also the festival, right? And I think that Wujian is indeed one of the probably most interesting new places, if I may say like this. Later we can discuss about it, right? In contemporary Chinese theater. Deljana, would you like to continue?
I'll unmute before I start. Thanks very much, Raimund. That was very, very interesting. And thanks, Anna, for the introduction. So I should start today. Sorry about that. I should start by stating that what I'm presenting today is most certainly not based on empirical research so far. It is also far from a thorough theoretical intervention. And at this stage, my paper is more of a proposal, an outline of something that I would like to engage with and develop in the future. As Anna already stated at the beginning of this session. It is, of course, about China, as urban transformation has most dramatically taken place in this context in recent years. I would like to acknowledge that, again, the proposition I make today are not exclusively my own, but developed with Anna, and that even the images included in this presentation are not my own, but taken from the internet and the public domain. So, theater is a cultural practice. It is art form and architectural typology. We know that theater does not exist in itself, rather it is part of and sustained by social and technical infrastructures. These may include the social infrastructures of cultural production, as much as the mundane infrastructures of water and waste management. In that such infrastructures are entangled with social, technical, and ecological systems at different spatial and temporal scales, they enable theater to take on a transformative role in society and the environment more broadly. Yet despite the recent infrastructural turn in the humanities and social sciences, the precise moments, spaces, processes, and outcomes of infrastructural entanglement between theater and the wider social material and spatial environments remains remarkably understudied. And so in this paper, I begin to apply an infrastructural lens to think about the interface between theater and the mundane. I want to frame theatrical infrastructuring as the processes and outcomes of intersection, interaction, and co-evolution between theater and the social technical infrastructural systems that sustain it, that it produces, and of which it is part. The focus is on China as the locus of dramatic social-spatial transformation since 1949. China's theater architecture and spaces of performance have been continuously evolving. Theater is weaving itself into the fabric of infrastructures of the city. Infrastructures tie theater into the city, and so I ask, how do the social and technical infrastructural systems that sustain theater intersect, interact, and co-evolve with this seemingly ordinary infrastructure, the infrastructural systems of the everyday urban environment? Let's begin with a pragmatic question. What is theater? I've said it before, it is cultural practice, it is art form and architectural typology. Today I will be focusing on theater as architectural typology as the simplest of its forms. Much recent urban development in China, as elsewhere, has been driven by the assumption that culture can be employed as a driver for economic growth. With the expansion of China's cultural and creative industries, artistic urbanization, as it is called, including the construction of attention-seeking theater architecture, has become an important strategy for regeneration, revitalization, and redevelopment of China's cities. In today's China, artistic practice quite literally takes place as a function of global capitalism and the legacies of state socialism. Ren, for instance, argues that nationalism and the cultural ideology of global consumerism are the drivers of flagship architecture in China. Bureaucrats choose the global architectural language to reflect China's ambitions. Recent star architecture, such as that of the National Grand Theatre of China in Beijing, has been interpreted as wishful cultural practice in the context of a complicated social political drama. That's Tang in 2019. China's megacities are prime examples of theatrical infrastructuring and the rapid urban social-spatial transformation. They contain areas of vastly different character within their administrative boundaries. This includes densely populated, redeveloped urban centers and new-built satellite towns that are excellently connected to municipal cultural infrastructures and the sustaining social and technical infrastructural systems. It includes also older inner city urban neighborhoods that may continue to rely on local and sometimes improvised theaters and or performance spaces. It includes urban villages and areas slated for redevelopment where theatrical infrastructures do not exist or have long fallen prey to urban transformation. And finally, it includes rural areas with sparse, if any, connections to contemporary theatrical and or mundane infrastructural systems. And this, by the way, is what the local theater looks like in this particular village in Jian. Contemporary trends in Chinese theater, as we just saw, include the appearance of new forms such as little theater or outdoor theatrical performances, where, I quote, traditional types of stage settings as well as the tableau are replaced by real architectonic backdrops and the real lives surrounding them, thus blurring the boundaries between performance and real life. And thus, just as we defined an architectural typology, we will have to abandon this working definition at least momentarily, because the role of architecture as a container of theater has long been displaced by the theatrical and political event. Traditional theater spaces are being abandoned for the sake of non-representational spaces, the kind of performative architecture favored by the symbolists, constructivists, and surrealists of the past and the contemporary avant-garde. Theater is no longer contained, it has been released, and it is now free to weave itself into the fabric and infrastructures of the city. Hannah argues that we need to overcome theater architecture and its typological preconceptions and embrace the notion of performance space and its connotation of spatial action. Here, the built environment housing the event is itself an event. Now, that said, let's return to the more traditional definition of theatrical architecture, or theater buildings as the site of theater. Theater changes with developments in technology. Theater lighting and the transition from central chandeliers to gas lighting and later electricity offer a fascinating case in point. Theater is the outcome of more obviously related cultural practices, such as creating, producing, performing, or watching theater, and those less visibly connected, such as creating, building, cleaning, air conditioning, lighting, heating, and so on. Theater is sustained by the infrastructures that support those more and less visible cultural and social practices, in that the immediate processes and infrastructures of theater are entangled with the smaller and larger scale processes and infrastructures that enable or cancel them. They are woven into the process and the infrastructures of the city. Infrastructure ties theater into the city. I propose to think theater as infrastructural node, connecting the infrastructures that make and sustain it, and infrastructuring cultural, social practices in turn. Our everyday lives are, I quote, conditioned, determined, enabled, and disrupted, in a word, structured by infrastructure. And so I draw on the notion of infrastructure ring as taking into account the interrelatedness of actors, technologies, and orders, to argue that theatrical infrastructuring combines and holds together otherwise independent social practices as complexes of practice. For instance, if we conceptualize going to the theater or watching a play as social practice, we can identify associations with other practices like going for dinner, before or afterwards, driving, parking, or, as is the case with performance spaces increasingly located in shopping malls, various other practices of consumption. This is the favorite subject. This is a bathroom in one of Shanghai's new performance and exhibition centers. So theater, like the city, is, I quote again, an ever-changing material, aesthetic, and social structure where many people gather to participate in complex social activities. It is also usually located in cities. Theater is therefore in some ways symptomatic of the urban process, demonstrating the structure, social power dynamics, politics, and economies also at work more broadly throughout the city. That's Harvey, 2009. In this sense, and here I refer to Rogers and O'Neill, buildings, wires, pipes, roadways are shaping people's direct relationships both with each other and with the environment in cities. Infrastructure is therefore an ideal ethnographic site to develop our understanding of social ordering and the form of the state, citizenship, criminality, ethnicity, and class, and many, many other markers, and how they play out concretely at the level of everyday practice. However, it is often overlooked that theater may be sustained by multiple, sometimes wasteful and unsustainable infrastructures in the systems, and that the production or protection of cultural assets or cultural performances depends on resources that range from energy to space. Furthermore, infrastructures are often entangled with how socioeconomic disparities are maintained and perpetuated. Tracing infrastructural networks can then reveal patterns of uneven social development. Rogers and O'Neill suggests that broader processes of marginalization, abjection, and disconnection often become operational and sustainable in contemporary cities through infrastructure. There are countless examples where well-intentioned theater-related urban development projects have created infrastructures that benefit some groups and disadvantage others. For instance, interventions planned to develop cultural infrastructure have ultimately led to the displacement and further marginalization of already marginalized populations, such as the urban poor or rural to urban migrants. Examining infrastructural interactions with cultural and social practice at moments of major social, spatial, and political restructuring, then, as experienced in China's tumultuous recent years, I built here on the assumption that, and I quote Angelo and Henschel, the social work done through and around infrastructure, such as how investments are made, forms of regulation change, new infrastructural systems are put in place, or old ones are repurposed or destroyed. All these can reveal patterns of social integration and differentiation, feelings of belonging or alienation, connection or isolation, and political engagement or lack thereof. If we think of theater as a node of social and material infrastructures, we may ask how changes in theatrical infrastructures, including the appearance, transformation, and disappearance of theater infrastructure, may impact on entangled communities of practice, including theater practitioners and audiences, and the local communities within which such infrastructures are embedded. We will have to talk about this one because I find this very, very exciting. This is a play that takes place within an actual hotel rather than within a theater. It's called Sleep No More, a new hit in Shanghai, apparently. So, despite the enormous impact of changing theatrical infrastructures on cultural and social practices in transition in China, and by implication, their changing sustainability outcomes, the interactions of people with theater as art form and concrete material form, and the implications for the dynamics of cultural and social practice have not been systemically examined. And so I propose that using a micro unit of analysis may help to draw macro conclusions. In the words of Angelo and Henschel, taking encounters between people and infrastructure as units of analysis and connecting them to illuminate how infrastructure shapes the social world. Thus, thinking theater as infrastructuring allows us to overcome partial understandings by connecting apparently distinct places and experiences. Research on theater's infrastructuring requires the application of an infrastructural lens to combine interdisciplinary knowledge and approaches to study how the social and technical infrastructural systems that sustain theater intersect, interact, and co-evolve with aspects of culture, performance, and architecture on the one hand, and with the seemingly ordinary infrastructural systems of the everyday urban environment, such as transformation, sanitation, and energy on the other. At the heart of the research agenda proposed here, then, is therefore the question of how theater infrastructuring benefits or violates the health and well-being of humans on either side of the stage, now and in the future. So there's an urgent need to study the impact of different performance spaces and their transformation from emergence over redevelopment to disappearance on the everyday, on professional and cultural lives of communities in contemporary China. The questions to ask are how the practices of making theater shaped by infrastructures. What are the unintended consequences of theater infrastructuring, and how may theater infrastructuring contribute to the violation of the rights of disadvantaged populations and ecologies now and in the future? And all these are questions that the research agenda proposed here may help to answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Deljana, for connecting, I think, the theater also to a larger context, right, of the city and the life in the city. Now it's my own turn, and I need to look for my presentation. Okay. So this is now the last one, and it's a little bit more historical, and I also hope to show especially how much these places have changed, right, in recent decades. So the title of this presentation is Building Biographies Towards an Alternative History of Chinese Theater. So first of all, I would like to share this picture with you that maybe you have already noticed, and it was taken during the recent Winter Olympics in February 2022 in Beijing. It shows a performer in a very specific performance space, the so-called big air shougang. This is a curved slope for freestyle ski. And that can be found out very easily on the internet, and this can be seen also from this picture. This place, the big air shougang slope, has been constructed in the area of a former steel plant owned by the capital steel company, Shoudu Gangtie Gongsi, which had itself developed from the Shijingshan steel plant, right? So this place was an important steel plant in China until 2010. Then it started production after 91 years. And this whole area outside Beijing was reprogrammed from an industrial area to a leisure or recreation area. And the steel plant became the background for this performance here. So in terms of theater, there is one more detail that seems very interesting to me, and this detail needs a little bit more of research. In this area, there was also a theater. The May 1st theater, Shougang Wu Juchang, a theater for the workers of the steel plant. So this theater was built in 1955 for the people who were living and working at the steel plant. And it was an important place, of course, for meetings and for cultural activities, for all kinds of performances, musical concerts, and watching movies. As many others of the performance places built in that times, this place was used for any kind of activity. So nowadays, we usually see these very specialized performance spaces, the concert hall, the opera house, the black box theater. But one, I think, of the characteristics of the performance places built in that times was that they were built and used as multifunctional places. So many of these performance places have been demolished in recent decades together with the architecture they were connected to. And this is also the case for the May 1st theater and the steel plant. So from the perspective of performance history, I think that these two pictures, the Big Air Shogang and the Shogang May 1st Theater, provide us with a stimulating starting point for reflecting on the transformations which have been happening and are still going on in Chinese theater. So transformations which involve places, practices, actors, audiences, directors, politics, society, and many more aspects. So on the one hand, there is this super functional, simple theater building with a stage and an audience space built in the 1950s, which has probably been used by many people, maybe workers from the steel plant, maybe actors from the steel plant, maybe it has been used for guest performances. For sure, it has been used for political meetings or watching movies. But these are all just hypotheses now, because I have not found any sources until now about for performances, which kind of performances happen in this theater. And this place, like many other of these kind of places, appear as extremely common and normal for that times. So it is not mentioned in any history book of theater. I mean, I found it in a list. There's a list of theaters in Beijing, it's in the list, but it's not usually, these kind of places do not appear in history books. And also the performances are usually not mentioned. So even though they were probably an important aspect of the cultural life of many people. So on the other hand, there is this super modern futuristic slope planned by some of the most advanced architects of our times. And if the theater was built for the people working in the steel plant, the Big Air Shogang has been built for the Winter Olympics and an international audience. It is extremely famous and well known. It has not only been seen by people on the site, but especially by people watching the Olympics on screen. So if we think about the broader context of these places, one might notice that the Shogang May 1st Theater can be seen as part of a theater infrastructure which has been built inside factories or other big working units for workers. So this was extremely common, an extremely common kind of performance space. And also this theater is built in a very common way. It looks very similar to other theaters, these kind of theaters from that times. And on the other hand, the Big Air Shogang slope could be seen as part of a new network of sport venues, which have been built now for the Winter Olympics, for the Summer Olympics. And it could be also seen as interconnected with the new performance infrastructure that Deljana has just shown, right, of the 21st century China, big opera houses, big theaters. And as such, it is unique, right? It has its own signature. It has very singular characteristics. So I hope to have given you a sense of what it means to give a special attention to the historical dimension of contemporary Chinese performance places. And it means for me to dive into a fascinating field which is connected both to all aspects of theater and performance, as well as to society and everyday life of the people. So in order to study this kind of things, we propose this concept of building biographies or performance place biographies. So this means to look at these performance places not as something which is just there as a piece of wood or a piece of concrete, but as something which is developing, which is changing, or as a whole or in certain parts. Perhaps this happens because the environment is changing, right? So to be built and to be demolished are just two extremes. So more often the places change a little bit, they are adapted. And I think the reason for this is the interconnection with cultural practice or other practices, right? So therefore, to study building biographies also means to study the cultural practice, to study the theater, but from another point of view. And I think that sometimes, like in the case of the Shogang May 1st Theater, the focus on building biographies leads us to uncover some dimensions of theater culture that we have not been studying before. And sometimes the focus on building biographies allows us to understand some interconnections, as I hope to show with my next point, between certain plays or productions and the built environment. And very often, for me, the focus on building biographies shows us that our knowledge and understanding of Chinese theater, especially if we think theater in a broader perspective, is very limited. Because most of the books that we have are still based on plays and productions or some events or on politics. However, the focus on buildings and infrastructure can broaden our understanding of theater because the building or the theater place is right at the intersection or the meeting point or the node, as Deljana has called it, right, where everything comes together. So since my colleague Jian always was telling me that we should write a theater history, I propose that we can write a history, but a history starting from the places. A history which can be a series of building biographies and of course this kind of structure is inspired by Sima Qian's dramaturgy of history writing. So I just want, yes, to show you some example about how these histories could look like. And so the first one is actually the most common, or probably the most famous, one of the most famous playhouses of 20th century China, which is the Capital Theater, right? The theater, the tea house has been produced in the 1950s, and where many of the most important plays, also from the theater histories, have been staged. So this theater was built it was inaugurated in 1955, but the company, the Beijing People's Art Theater Company, was already founded in 52. And yes, so we can read that the places where this company previously performed had not been built for modern theater performances, the so-called spoken drama huaju, but some of these places were, for instance, cinemas. So there was no dressing room, no large backstage area, no technical equipment. So the Capital Theater was the first theater built for modern huaju spoken drama performances. And the plan was also to make it not too big. Everyone, everywhere in the audience should be able to see and to hear well. And for the stage, some of the most advanced techniques of that time were used. So yes, one interesting interconnection here in the 1950s, I think, is that yes, if we look at the plays that have been produced in that times, and we can do that if we look at the website of the Beijing People's Art Theater. It has a wonderful website with all the productions. We can see that at the end of the 1950s, actually many very big productions have been made, and some of them with many, many actors. And the Tea House, of course, the play that Deljana has already shown, the famous play by Lauscher, is actually the biggest among these productions with more than 50 actors. So one could say, yes, it's the time that the society is on stage or the masses are on stage, but maybe there is another interconnection, and that is that dramas such as the Tea House have been written especially also for this kind of stages and this kind of ensembles. So there might be an interconnection also with this kind of productions. And there's another interesting point here. Around the same time, many guest productions and also invited productions in that times from the Soviet Union and later on in the 1980s from Western European countries were staged at the Capital Theater. So again, we can also say that this is connected to the foreign politics. However, I argue that also these invited performances or guest performances are somehow interconnected with this performance plays. And yeah, so to come back to the Capital Theater, oh yeah, this is the Tea House, and yes, here you can see how many actors, like this is not all of them at the same time, but it's really many actors on the stage. So to come back to the Capital Theater, there is another extremely important moment, another interconnection between the infrastructure and the theater practice. And this is the emergence of the little theater, the xiao juchang, in the 1980s. So usually the books here refer to the work by Jian and Lin Zhaohua. So at the beginning, these performances took place in a rehearsal room at the Capital Theater, and later on, some specific little theater stages were formally installed at the Capital Theater, and later on also in other theaters like in the Tianxiao Theater. And later on again, all the new theaters that were built have a little theater stage, a xiao juchang or a black box theater from the beginning. So there is another change, like also always now about the discography of the Capital Theater. So in recent years, another stage has opened. It's called the Jian Theater, and this place has opened in a space which has always been used by the Beijing People's Art Theater, but it has been used previously as a kind of storage space, and later on it had been rented and used as a shop. And in the last years, it has been retransformed in a small theater space, which can also be rented and is used for different kinds of performances right in the center and on a busy street of Dongdan in the center of Beijing. And then I found another new development of the Capital Theater, which actually had not existed yet when we sent this proposal, or at least the place had not been inaugurated. Maybe people knew that it would be under construction. And this is this Beijing International Theater Center, which is right behind the Capital Theater. And I don't know yet, I have no idea yet about how to connect this to the production of theater, but I found it very interesting that here we see, of course, a very other type of architecture again. I need to think about the Feng Mao, right? There's a little bit of traditional Chinese architecture, and I think on the left you can still see the wall of the Capital Theater, right? Which is like this kind of more socialist construction, and on the back, of course, a very modern building. So this is just about the Capital Theater, the changes of the Capital Theater, which I think is one of the most famous theaters. I have some more examples here, so especially the small theaters. So these are my own pictures. This is why I'm very proud of them, that I took last time when I was in China in 2019. And yeah, so all of these pictures are so-called small theaters, or and most of them, or all of the pictures that I have chosen now, are actually is architecture that has not been designed for the theater, right? So there is a space which at some point has been adapted into a performance space. So here at the Ninth Theater, this was like the cultural center of the Chaoyang district, or here, very famous, the Penghao Theater in the middle of the Hutongs, or also here the Inside Out Theater, a little bit outside of the city center, which has been, which has also not been a theater space before. Or here, this is actually the Longfu Theater, which is actually, it was very famous as a cinema, but since, yes, I think there appeared so many new theaters in recent years, and also in the Longfu theaters, it is used both for screening, for film screenings, as well as for theater productions. This is a project for the future here, but I put it together because it would also be an amazing biography, I think. And is now more in the field of where Josh Sternberg for sure knows much more than myself. And what is also very interesting is that in recent years, some of the old tea house theaters are rebuilt. And so in the case of this, the Guanghe Theater, which is one of the most famous traditional Chinese theaters, and where Mei Lanfang, I think, has performed for the first time at the age of, I don't know, very young age. Josh knows this for sure. And so this place has been rebuilt several during the 20th century. So I just found this on Wikipedia. It's like a picture of the old Guanghe Theater. And then in the 1950s, it has been transformed in a modern theater, right? So the whole stage has been rebuilt into a modern, stage. And I think here this picture must be from the 1980s because it has been used also as a karaoke. You can see the karaoke. And then, but now it has been demolished and it has been rebuilt here in this, in the old style. So I found that really interesting. And yes, I think it's also a fascinating story, biography about a building. Yes, so this is all from my side. Thank you very much.